The Mystery at the Manor, Chapter 3. The Lion, the Queen, and the Big Black Bird. That afternoon they went up to their den. They had to walk across the top field and onto a small path leading into the trees. It was cool, shady, and dark, and no one else used this path very much. They went a little way into the woods. The undergrowth began to get a bit denser now, and the path, although much narrower, began to get lighter until it opened out into a clearing. There was a large tree on one side with dark red leaves. The ground underneath was bare, except for a few burrs on one side and some acorns under the other tree. The branches on one side of the oak tree had been cut back many years ago and had left the middle of the area open to the sky. The sunlight streamed in. It was a fabulous place for a den. The branches of dark red leaves reached almost to the ground at one side and gave the little glade a secret, private feel. The oak at the other side was an old tree, gnarled and knobbly. Its bark was rough and bumpy to the touch. Its branches were all uneven, and its roots were huge and grew across the floor of the clearing. Some of them had twisted themselves into amazing shapes. Pip had pointed out one particularly lumpy root the first time they found the den. This root looked for all the world like a lion. It even had a mane and two paws stretching out towards them. Beth had read the Narnia books and immediately wanted to call it Aslan's Lair, but Pip had declared that that was a sissy name. She had later shown him an almost perfect heart shape, black and smooth, on one side of the oak tree about halfway up, which almost looked as if it had been cut in the bark. Seeing the heart shape and the lion-like root, Pip had wanted to call the den Lionheart's Castle, as he'd been learning about Richard the Lionheart last term at school. They had argued with one another about a name for this secret place, but hadn't come to any agreement. In the end, they now just called it the Den. That had been their first day, and since then Nana had let them bring a few things over to make the den more snug. They had a couple of rugs, which they used to cover an old tree trunk to make a comfy seat. They used an old wooden crate to keep a few bits and pieces in. This included a plastic box containing a few sweets, some string, and one of the old lemonade bottles to use as a vase. They covered the crate with an old plank to make a table. They had found this plank under the bushes at the back of their den one day. On one side of it were the words "No trespassing," and it was written in faded black letters. They saw that the path that they had been following seemed to continue to the other side of a broken-down fence behind the bushes, and they realised that this must lead back to the old house. The sign had probably been put there when the path was in use. Ever since they had arrived, Beth had wanted to get a closer look at the house. She could hardly wait for tomorrow. She had left her reading book, wrapped in a plastic bag, in the crate, and now they settled down, she to read, and Pip, who had never been much of a reader, to have a go at making a bow and arrows. They were sitting very quietly when Beth noticed a squirrel scamper down the tree beside her, carrying something in its mouth. She watched it run a few feet and then begin digging with its front paws, and she realised it was going to bury an acorn. Suddenly there was a rustling sound next to her, and another squirrel joined in the fun. The first one was not too pleased with the company, and there began a great chattering and squawking as they chased each other, finally running up the oak tree and disappearing among its leaves. "I bet there's a nest in the hollow section of that tree," said Pip, who had been watching them too. When they got back to the caravan some time later, it was to see the dining table covered with all sorts of bits and pieces. Gramps seemed to have the entire contents of his tackle box, his fishing box, strewn over every available surface. Nana just shook her head, and raised her eyes to the ceiling as the children entered. "What are you up to?" asked Pip. Gramps was staring fixedly at what looked like an ordinary feather held between his fingers. "Just looking," he said, with a faraway look in his eyes. "Yes, but what are you looking at that for?" asked Pip. "Just wait a minute and see," answered Gramps. "I've been waiting for one of these for months," he explained eventually. "It's the tail feather of a swan. You don't come across them often, and I found it today. It's going to make the best float I've ever had." And as Pip watched, Gramps carefully pulled away all the small feathery bits, just leaving a long thick stalk. For the next half hour or so he sat surrounded by small pots of coloured enamel paints, carefully painting the stalk different shades. Pip watched fascinated. At last a small rubber tube was slotted halfway along its length, and a metal ring was carefully fixed to the bottom. "Just look at that! It's a piece of art, and it's the best one in my collection," said Gramps, satisfied with the new float. "Well, now that's done, let's get the table cleared," chided Nana, with a smile all over her face. "These bairns must be hungry by now." On the way to the showers after supper, Beth had to pass through the underworld. At least, that's what she called the dark, gloomy pathway overhung by trees. "What a strange place this is," she thought. "I wonder if I'll ever get used to it." It was getting rather overcast, and that evening it seemed darker and gloomier than ever. The overgrown hawthorn bushes met overhead, cutting out most of the light. She tried to walk quietly, but the gravel scrunched so loudly under her shoes that she kept looking around, feeling that someone was watching her. She had to pass the Shadows caravan. At least he wasn't around this time. Today she noticed a new sign displayed outside its door, handwritten like the other one. They'd seen the first sign a few days ago. It said, "If you are rude enough to let your dog foul in this area, have the decency to clear it up." And the new one said, "Keep your children quiet. Some of us are here for a bit of peace." Whoever he was, the Shadow didn't intend to be very sociable. She was glad to get into the open and to see Pip waiting for her. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, there was the usual knock at the bedroom door. "Drinking chocolate," called a familiar voice. Beth opened the door to see Nana, carrying 2 steaming mugs, one in each hand, and tonight, under her arm, was a large flat book. She popped the drinks on the bedside table. Pip came from his side of the room, wearing his dressing gown and slippers, to collect his drink. "Hello," said Nana. "While I was sorting out the dining room, I came across this tucked down behind the seats. I wondered if you would like to have a look at it. It used to belong to your mum when she was a little girl." Pip walked across to have a look. "Oh, it's only an old book," he said disappointedly. Nana smiled. "Well, I don't know about that. I think you could be wrong there. I wouldn't call it only a book. Look and see." She settled down on Beth's bed to show them. Beth sat next to her, but Pip sat on the floor, appearing to be not really interested. Nana put the book on her knee. It was a large old storybook, with a bright, shiny picture on the front and a red spring holding the pages together. "I know it belonged to your mum, but it's not just a girl's book," said Nana. "The stories are all from the Bible, and there are some really exciting ones in here." As if to prove what she was saying, she opened the book at random, and a large black bird suddenly seemed to leap off the page. In fact, it did stand out from the rest of the picture, because it was an old-fashioned pop-up book where certain characters had been cut out and folded so that they stood out from the other drawings on the page. "Oh," said Beth, moving a little closer. "What's that one called?" "Well now, let me see," said Nana. "It's about a man called Elijah, whom everyone is hunting, because the wicked queen wanted to kill him. He had to run away and hide in a lonely valley." Did the Queen find him? Asked Beth, thinking about the Wicked Queen in the Narnia books. Well, now that would be telling, said Nana. Your mum used to choose a different story each night, and I would read it to her as she sat drinking her chocolate. Would you like me to do that for you too? Oh, that would be nice, said Beth. So we would get to choose which story? Yes, you would, answered Nana. OK, said Beth, ignoring the fact that Pip was still not looking very interested. Can we have this one today? She asked. Nana smiled and began reading as they drank their chocolate and Beth looked at the pictures. Nana pretended not to notice, but she was aware of Pip leaning a little closer as she got to the exciting bit where the huge black ravens came swooping down into the lonely valley. Were they spies sent by the Wicked Queen? Or were they there for some other reason? The answer turned out to be very unexpected. That was really good, said Beth as the story finished. I hadn't heard that story before, said Pip, sounding quite surprised. Neither had I, said Beth, but it was a bit of a gory ending for the horrid bossy Queen falling from the window and getting eaten by the dogs, said Beth. Yes, it was a bit, wasn't it, said Nana. But that sort of thing happened in those days, didn't it, Nana? Responded Pip, trying to sound very knowledgeable. Indeed it did, she replied, closing the book. Some of the stories are well known and some are less familiar. You'll both know this one, she said, indicating the picture on the cover, which showed a rainbow over a large crowd of animals coming out of an enormous boat. Noah's Ark, they said together, and with that Nana said good night, took their mugs away, and went back to see how Gramps was getting on, sorting out his tackle in preparation for the next day.